Welcome to Tales of the Bard. Step into a world where stories come alive and imagination knows no bounds. Join me as I weave enchanting tales reminiscent of the bards of old, sharing legends, myths, and original stories that will transport you to distant lands and forgotten times. The tavern was quieter tonight, the usual raucous laughter and chatter replaced by a sense of anticipation. The story had taken a darker turn, and Jonty, sitting by the fire with his lute resting on his knee, let the tension build as he prepared to recount one of the most harrowing moments in Ronan and Lira's journey. The patrons leaned in closer as the bard strummed a single haunting note on his lute, the sound echoing softly through the room. His voice was low and solemn as he began to weave the tale, his eyes flickering in the firelight. The night Ronan felt the bond break. It was a night like any other, Jonty began, his voice soft but filled with tension. But as Ronan lay in his bed in the heart of the Druid grove, something woke him suddenly. He sat up, his heart racing, but it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was absence. The connection he had always felt with Lira, that subtle bond that linked them across the miles, was gone. He reached for his amulet, but there was no hum, no warmth, only silence. Jonty's fingers moved lightly over the lute strings, creating a soft, unsettling melody. For a moment, panic surged through him, but then he heard it. A faint tapping at his window. He turned and saw the silver hawk, its eyes glowing in the moonlight, its wings shimmering with the magic of the blue trees. Skryla had come to him in her hawk form, and though she could not speak in this form, her message was clear. The bard's voice grew more urgent as he described the scene. She led him outside, where Eris, his loyal windstrider, waited for him, wings outstretched and ready to take flight. Skryla circled above them, guiding Ronan with an urgency that made his heart race. He didn't hesitate. Pulling on his clothes, grabbing his druid staff and his bag of herbs and potions, Ronan mounted Eris and took to the skies, the cold night air biting at his skin. The flight to the castle, Jonty's music picked up in tempo, mimicking the beat of Eris's wings as Ronan flew toward the castle. The journey was a blur, the wind whipping through his hair as Eris sped through the sky, guided by Skryla's silver form. The castle loomed ahead, dark and imposing, and Ronan's heart pounded in his chest. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The bard's voice grew more intense. When he landed in the courtyard, the king himself met him, his face lined with worry. "She's in her room," the king said, his voice heavy with sorrow. He led Ronan through the castle halls, and with every step, Ronan's fear grew. By the time they reached Lira's bedroom, his heart felt like it was lodged in his throat. Jonty's fingers strummed a slow, mournful chord as he spoke of the moment Ronan entered the room. There she was, lying on her bed, her face pale, her lips slightly parted as though she had fallen asleep. But Ronan knew, the moment he touched her cheek, that this was no ordinary sleep. Her skin was ice cold, her breath shallow and labored. He had seen these symptoms before. She had been poisoned. "Feel free to ask if you need any further assistance." The healing touch. The bard's music became softer, more intimate as he described Ronan's next actions. Ronan's heart sank, but he didn't let the panic overwhelm him. He knew what had to be done. The gift of healing he had gained from the hot springs could save her, but it was not a magic he wanted to display in front of the others. This power was personal, sacred. He needed to be alone with her. Jonty's voice was filled with urgency. He turned to the king and the others in the room. "Please leave us," he said, his voice calm but firm. There was hesitation in their eyes, but the king nodded, trusting Ronan's judgment. One by one, they left the room, closing the door softly behind them. The bard's fingers moved slowly, playing a soft, gentle melody. Now alone, Ronan knelt by Lira's bedside, his heart aching at the sight of her. He leaned down and whispered her name, his voice barely audible. "Lira." He knew that his healing touch, the power he had discovered in the hot springs, could rid her of the poison that threatened her life. Jonty smiled softly as he described the tender moment. He took her hand in his fingers trembling slightly as he felt her cold skin beneath his own. He leaned closer, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, and then, with all the love in his heart, he kissed her. The bard's music grew warmer, more hopeful. As his lips touched hers, Ronan felt the familiar warmth of his healing magic begin to flow through him, spreading from his chest and down into his hands, his touch. He could feel her body slowly warming beneath his fingers, the ice that had gripped her slowly melting away. Jonty's voice was filled with emotion as he continued. He held her close, cradling her as the poison was drawn from her body, replaced by the warmth of life. It was a slow process, but Ronan remained calm, his healing magic steady and sure. He could feel the poison leaving her, dissipating like smoke in the air, and with it, the coldness faded from her skin. Lira's recovery. The bard's music grew lighter, more joyful as he spoke of Lira's recovery. After what felt like an eternity, Ronan finally felt her stir in his arms. Her breath came easier now, her cheeks no longer pale but flushed with warmth. He whispered her name again, his voice barely more than a breath, and this time, her eyes fluttered open. Jonty smiled as he described the moment. Lira looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion at first, but then recognition. "Ronan," she whispered, her voice weak but alive. He smiled down at her, relief flooding his heart. "You're safe now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The bard's fingers moved gently over the lute strings, playing a soft, tender melody. For a moment they stayed like that, holding each other in the quiet of the room. Ronan could feel the last traces of the poison leaving her, the warmth of life fully restored. He had saved her, the price of healing. Jonty's music slowed, becoming more somber as he spoke of the price Ronan had paid for the healing. But Ronan knew that such power came at a cost. The healing magic he had gained from the hot springs was not limitless, and every time he used it, it took something from him, his strength, his energy, his connection to the wilds. He could feel the toll it had taken, a deep weariness settling into his bones. The bard's voice was soft as he described Ronan's sacrifice, but he didn't care. Lira was alive, and that was all that mattered. He would pay any price, endure any cost to keep her safe. Jonty's fingers played a final gentle chord as he brought the tale to a close. And so, as the dawn began to break outside the castle walls, Ronan sat by Lyra's side, watching over her as she slept, her hand still in his. The poison was gone, and her life was saved. But the battle was far from over, for there were forces at work that would stop at nothing to tear them apart. The tavern was silent as Jonty finished, the weight of the story settling over the patrons like a heavy blanket. Ronan's sacrifice, his love for Lira, and the quiet strength that had saved her life left everyone in awe. The bond between them had grown stronger in the face of danger, and the patrons knew that this was only the beginning of their fight against the forces that sought to destroy them. With a final reverent bow, Jonty left the tavern, leaving behind a room full of wonder and admiration for the love that had saved Lira's life and the strength of the Druid who had risked everything to protect her. Jonty returned to the fire that evening with a somber expression. The tavern was unusually quiet, the patrons still reflecting on the tale of Ronan's desperate race to save Lira. The story had taken a dark turn, and there was a lingering question on everyone's mind. What kind of poison could have been so deadly, so dangerous, that even Lira, strong and resilient, had fallen victim to it? The bard, sensing the unspoken curiosity, strummed his lute gently, filling the tavern with a low, eerie melody. His eyes gleamed in the firelight as he prepared to reveal the sinister nature of the poison that had nearly claimed Lira's life. The poison of the Hagborn, Veilshade. The poison that struck Lira down, Jonty began, his voice low and filled with dread, was no ordinary venom. It was a creation of dark magic, a concoction brewed in the shadowed dens of the Hagborn witches, a poison known only as Veilshade. The patrons shifted uncomfortably at the mention of the Hagborn, their faces reflecting the fear and revulsion that came with the name. Jonty continued, his fingers dancing lightly over the lute strings as he described the poison's malevolent origins. Veilshade is not a poison of the body alone, the bard explained, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It is a curse, a venom infused with dark sorcery, designed not just to kill, but to sever the soul's connection to the living world. It creeps through the veins like a shadow, turning the victim cold and lifeless, draining not just their strength, but their very essence. Jonty's eyes flickered as he continued, his tone growing darker. It was created long ago by the Hagborn, those twisted witches who dwell in the dark corners of the world, weaving spells of death and decay. The recipe for Veilshade is a closely guarded secret, passed down through the Hagborn covens, and it can only be brewed under a new moon, when the veil between the worlds is at its thinnest. The symptoms of Veilshade. The bard's music took on a more haunting, rhythmic quality as he spoke of the poison's effects. The first sign of veil shade poisoning is a sudden, unnatural cold, spreading through the body like frost on a winter morning. The victim's skin pales, and their breath becomes shallow, as if the very air around them has turned frigid. Jonty's voice filled with quiet intensity. But it is not just the body that suffers. The poison attacks the spirit, pulling it toward the veil of death, creating a sense of disconnection, of slipping away. Those who fall victim to veil shade describe it as feeling as though they are being erased, their memories, their will, even their very sense of self being slowly consumed by the darkness. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of the description settle over the room. For Lira, that cold Ronan felt when he touched her cheek, the ice that gripped her, was the poison at work, pulling her toward death, severing her connection to the world of the living. Had Ronan arrived any later, she might not have been able to come back. The crafting of veil shade. Jonty's fingers plucked at the lute, his music becoming more twisted, reflecting the dark magic behind the poison. Veil shade is brewed using ingredients that are as cursed as the poison itself. It is said that the witches use the sap of the deathroot plant, a vile herb that only grows in places where the earth has been soaked with blood. This sap is then mixed with nightshade petals and the venom of a creature that most fear to name, the shadow serpent, a beast that slithers between the worlds of the living and the dead. The bard's voice filled with quiet horror as he continued. But the key to veil shade's deadly power is not its ingredients alone. The witches who brew it imbue the poison with a soul curse, using the blood of a victim as a conduit for their dark magic. This curse makes veil shade far more dangerous than any ordinary poison. It is not just a toxin, but a spiritual affliction, one that can only be cured by the purest forms of magic. The cure. Jonty's music shifted, becoming lighter but still tinged with tension. And that is why Ronan's touch, his healing magic gained from the hot springs, was able to save Lira's life. The springs themselves are imbued with the essence of life, a magic as old as the world itself. When Ronan bathed in those waters, he became connected to that life force, able to channel it through his hands to heal even the most grievous wounds. The bard smiled softly as he continued. But healing a poison like veil shade requires more than just power. It requires love. Ronan's feelings for Lira, the bond they shared, made his magic even stronger, giving him the ability to push back the poison, to draw it out of her body and restore her warmth, her life. Jonty's fingers danced over the lute strings, playing a soft, hopeful melody. Without that love, without the strength of his connection to her, Ronan might not have been able to save her. The poison was powerful, yes, but love and light are stronger still. A dark warning. The bard's music slowed, becoming more ominous once again as he gave a final warning. But veil shade is not gone. The Hagborn witches still brew it in their dark covens, waiting for the moment when they can strike again. Their magic is not easily defeated, and though Lira survived this time, the danger is far from over. Jonty's eyes flickered with intensity as he finished. The Hagborn will not stop until they have claimed what they seek, power over life and death, and the fall of the kingdoms that stand against them. Ronan and Lira's battle with them is only beginning, and veil shade is just one of the many tools the witches will use in their quest for domination. The tavern sat in stunned silence as Jonty strummed the final note, the weight of the story settling over them like a shadow. The poison that had nearly claimed Lira's life was more than just a venom. It was a curse, a manifestation of the Hagborn's dark magic, and its threat still lingered in the world. As Jonty stood and bowed, the patrons erupted into applause, but there was an edge to their cheers, a lingering fear in their hearts. They had learned the name of the poison, but they also knew that its creators were still out there, waiting for their next move. With a final nod, Jonty left the tavern, his story hanging in the air like the chill of veil shade itself. The tavern was packed that evening, the air thick with tension as the patrons awaited Jonty's next tale. The bard had promised to reveal the next chapter in Ronan's story, and the audience was eager to hear how the young Druid would confront the dangers lurking within the king's court. Jonty strummed a few slow, deliberate notes on his lute, letting the anticipation build before he began. The shapeshifter's deception. After healing Lira and feeling the warmth return to her skin, Ronan knew something far darker was at play. Jonty began, his voice low and filled with quiet intensity. The poison that had nearly taken Lira's life was no accident. It had been carefully administered by someone with ill intent. And Ronan had his suspicions. His sharp senses, honed through years of communion with the natural world, had detected something unnatural in the court, someone hiding in plain sight. Jonty's fingers moved lightly over the strings of his lute, playing a melody that mirrored the creeping unease that filled the room. It was the woman in the red dress, her presence too perfect, her movements too calculated. Ronan had sensed something off about her from the moment he arrived at the castle, but now he was certain she was not who she appeared to be. She was a shapeshifter, sent by the Hagborn witches to infiltrate the royal court and poison Lira. The patrons leaned in closer, captivated by the mounting tension. Jonty's voice dropped to a near whisper as he described Ronan's realization. But Ronan knew that confronting her outright would be a mistake. If the shapeshifter realized that her cover had been blown, she would either flee or lash out, and the chance to turn the tables on her would be lost. Instead, Ronan devised a plan, a way to use the shapeshifter's deception against her, to entrap her and force her to serve his cause. Entrapping the shapeshifter. Jonty's music picked up in tempo, mimicking the urgency of Ronan's next move. After ensuring that Lira was safe, Ronan called for the king, who had been waiting anxiously outside the room. The king entered, his face pale with concern, but Ronan's voice was calm and steady as he spoke. The bard's voice shifted, taking on the tone of Ronan's quiet determination. "Your Majesty," Ronan said, his eyes locked with the king's. "The woman in the red dress is not who she appears to be. She is a shapeshifter sent by the Hagborn to infiltrate your court. I suspect she is the one who poisoned Lira." Jonty's fingers played a tense staccato rhythm as he described the king's reaction. The king's face grew tight with anger, but Ronan held up a hand to calm him. "We must not let her know that we are aware of her deception," Ronan continued. "If she realizes we have uncovered her true nature, she will escape, and we will lose our chance to turn this situation to our advantage." The bard's voice filled with quiet cunning as he revealed Ronan's plan. "I want to entrap her," Ronan said, his voice soft but firm. "We will pretend to know nothing, and in the meantime, I will subtly manipulate her into sending false messages to the Hagborn. If we can feed the witches misinformation, we can turn their plans against them." Laying the trap. Jonty's music shifted to a lighter, more strategic melody, reflecting Ronan's clever planning. The king, though hesitant at first, agreed to the plan. He trusted Ronan's instincts, and he knew that the threat of the Hagborn witches was too great to leave anything to chance. Together, they began laying the groundwork for the trap. The bard's fingers danced over the lute strings as he described the subtle moves that followed. Ronan began by observing the shapeshifter carefully, studying her every move. He watched how she interacted with the court, how she ingratiated herself with the nobles, how she slipped in and out of conversations like a shadow. But most importantly, he watched for the moments when she thought no one was looking. Jonty smiled as he described Ronan's cunning. Whenever the shapeshifter's guard was down, Ronan would slip small pieces of false information into the conversations around her. Rumors of the king's plans, whispers of alliances with neighboring kingdoms, details of troop movements that were, in reality, fabrications. The bard's voice grew more intense as he spoke of the tension building in the court. And all the while, Ronan made sure to keep up the pretense that nothing was amiss. The shapeshifter continued her charade, unaware that she was being manipulated, unaware that every false message she sent to the Hagborn was a piece of the puzzle that would lead to her downfall. The shapeshifter's misstep. Jonty's music took on a darker tone, reflecting the moment when the trap began to close. Days passed and the shapeshifter grew bolder, confident that her deception was going unnoticed. But she had underestimated Ronan's ability to sense the shifts in the natural world. One evening, while she was alone in the garden, Ronan felt a faint disturbance in the magic of the blue trees, a flicker of dark energy, like a shadow passing through the leaves. The bard's voice filled with quiet triumph. He knew in that moment that the shapeshifter was communicating with her masters. Using his connection to the blue tree network, Ronan focused his magic, listening to the faint whispers of the wind, the soft rustle of the leaves. And there, hidden in the currents of the natural world, he heard it, the shapeshifter's voice, sending a message to the Hagborn. Jonty smiled as he described the moment. But the message she sent was not the truth. It was the false information Ronan had carefully planted. The shapeshifter, believing she was serving her masters, had unwittingly become a tool in Ronan's plan. The king's return. The music softened as Jonty brought the tale to its next crucial moment. With the shapeshifter's deception exposed, Ronan knew the time had come to act. He called the king back into the room, his face calm but his mind racing with the steps they would need to take. The bard's voice took on the weight of the decision before them. "Your Majesty," Ronan said quietly, "the shapeshifter has already communicated the false information to the Hagborn. They will believe what we want them to believe. Now we must move quickly to set the final trap." Jonty's fingers played a soft, ominous melody as he described the king's response. The king nodded, his jaw clenched with resolve. Together, they would allow the shapeshifter to continue her charade, but in the shadows, they would prepare for the final confrontation with the Hagborn witches. A dangerous game. Jonty's music grew lighter but filled with tension, reflecting the danger of Ronan's plan. But the game Ronan was playing was a dangerous one. The Hagborn witches were powerful and cunning, and the shapeshifter was not without her own tricks. If Ronan's plan failed, if the witches realized they had been deceived, the consequences could be disastrous, not just for Ronan and Lira, but for the entire kingdom. The bard's voice dropped to a near whisper, but Ronan was willing to take that risk. He knew that the only way to defeat the Hagborn was to outwit them, to turn their own magic against them, and with the king by his side, and Lira recovering under his watchful eye, he was ready to see the plan through to the end. The tavern sat in silence as Jonty finished, the tension of the story still thick in the air. The patrons knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger plot, a game of deception and magic that would test Ronan's cunning and resolve. As Jonty stood and bowed, the room erupted into applause, the excitement and anticipation for what would come next filling the room. With a final nod and a knowing smile, the bard left the tavern, leaving behind a room full of eager listeners, ready for the next chapter in Ronan's fight against the Hagborn witches.